Hi, my name is Connor Ferguson, and I'm an assistant professor of weed science here at Mississippi State University. Today I'm going to talk to you about weed control in Xtendflex soybean. So what's new for 2021 are varieties of soybean that are tolerant, of course, to dicamba and glyphosate, which we've had since Xtend varieties were released in soybean. But with new varieties hitting the market, they will also have tolerance to glufosinate or Liberty. This may sound familiar because in dicamba-tolerant cotton, we've had Xtendflex varieties since the very first cultivars were released back in 2017 that allow us to spray dicamba, glyphosate, and glufosinate or Liberty. Obviously, with applying Liberty, even in our dicamba-tolerant crops, applying dicamba is quite a different beast, if you will, than applying Liberty or glufosinate. The restrictions on the use for dicamba include things like larger droplet-sized nozzles and the use of a drift reduction adjuvant, both of which do not work well with glufosinate or Liberty. Some common nozzle types labeled for use with dicamba are things like the TTI 60, which is a twin fan version of the TTI, the ULD 12004, and the TADF-D. They made a particular version for dicamba use with a larger tip size than the normal TADF. And those nozzle types do not work well for use with Liberty. In fact, as you'll see in this next study, we did a study this past summer to look at applying Liberty with dicamba-tolerant nozzles. So in this study, we looked at 3 different nozzle types labeled for use in dicamba: the TTI, the ULD Max, which is a new nozzle type that Hypro makes for John Deere, and the Mug nozzle. The Mug nozzle is probably the one you're the least familiar with. It's made by a company out of Brazil. And the key with the Mug nozzle, if you're able to get them, is they're labeled for use all the way down to an O2 and labeled for use with pressure ranges from 20 to 90 psi. But as you can see from this first slide, at 14 days after application, so what we did is we applied multiple different tank mixtures with Liberty, but using all of the application requirements for dicamba. So we had the larger droplet-sized nozzles and the use of a drift reduction adjuvant. Again, both of which do not do a very good job of controlling weeds with Liberty. And you can see in these 3 slides, 14 days after application, the TTI nozzle on the left, the ULD Max nozzle in the middle, and the Mug nozzle on the far right, that at 14 days after application, it actually looked like we had pretty decent control, with anywhere ranging from the mid-80s to the low 90% for water hemp control. But fast forward just 2 weeks, as you see in this slide, our control is very different. What looked like it may have died now has come back to life. And you can see our best control percentage of the TTI, the ULD Max, and the Mug nozzle was just at 63%, which is really quite pitiful in terms of weed control. Glufosinate, as you recall, is a very tough herbicide in the sense that things may look very dead, but then come back to life. Here on this next slide is a picture of a study we did this summer looking at applying Liberty or glufosinate at different rates. And this is the full labeled rate here, and you can see in these 4 slides, starting in the top left, that plot at 7 days after application. Things look pretty dead. It's a pretty good looking control there. Then you fast forward to 14 days after application, and things start looking a little more hairy. You can see some green sort of showing up in the background there. And it's not new growing weeds, this is regrowing weeds. Even more obvious at 21 days after application, and finally at 28 days after application, things that look dead have come back to life. This is especially apparent on this next slide, where you can see a water hemp plant sprayed 7 days after application. The growing point is completely burned. That plant should be dying. But just fast forward 2 weeks, 21 days after application, and suddenly now things aren't looking so good, as that water hemp plant has regrown from different growing points on the plant. It's one of the particular issues with glufosinate or Liberty that really, to make it successful, you've got to have good coverage, and you've got to, in my estimation, make a sequential application within 7 to 10 days to ensure you really get good control with that. Another issue with applying dicamba and glufosinate in the same system is that dicamba makes grass control herbicides work less effectively. In this next study to talk about, we know for a fact that antagonism happens between dicamba and clethodim things like Select Max or Select, and dicamba and glyphosate, things like Roundup, that they antagonize. They make grass control less effective. I'm sure you heard plenty from Larry Steckel at Tennessee talk about it this past summer and the summer before. Certainly Jason Bond here in Mississippi talk a lot about it. It's an issue we're seeing across the state and across the region where grass control in a dicamba system is not working well. So what we wanted to do is see how we apply these herbicides, dicamba and our grass control herbicides, differently to see if we can overcome herbicide antagonism. So all of these studies were sprayed at 15 gallons per acre, and our 3 different treatment types. So we had clethodim or Select Max applied by itself, glyphosate or Roundup Power Max applied by itself. Then we looked at the tank mixtures of Roundup Power Max and Select Max with dicamba. And then we looked at applying both products at the same time, but out of separate tanks. And you can see what our sprayer looked like. It looks very complex, but of course it's made to apply lots of products in small areas. But as you see on this next slide, the picture of our separate boom method. So each herbicide was in its own tank, went through its own plumbing system, went through its own set of electronic ball valves, and applied out of a separate boom and a separate set of nozzles, the dicamba and the Select Max, or the dicamba and the Roundup Power Max. So taking a look at some results, as you can see on this slide, the different letters indicate that statistics have separated them out. So wherever you see A's, there's no difference. Wherever you see B's, there are differences. And you can see across these different sites, so we had multiple studies looking at control of things like Italian ryegrass and broadleaf signal grass and brown top millet. You can see that there's no differences across all of these sites between applying the grass herbicide by itself, here in this first slide is Roundup, versus applying Roundup and dicamba through separate tanks and separate booms. But you can see that there is less control observed with the tank mixture. This is even more obvious when you look at the next slide, taking a look at the pictures of the plot. So this is Roundup by itself, Roundup with dicamba in the tank, and you can see how much green there is in that plot. That's certainly antagonism occurring. And then down in the bottom middle, you can see the plot with dicamba and Roundup applied separately. And it compared very well to the Roundup by itself. Shifting gears, looking at the different graph, but now looking at it with clethodim or Select Max, again we see the same trend. When clethodim is applied by itself and clethodim and dicamba are applied from separate tanks, we have no herbicide antagonism observed. But when we put them together in the tank, we see reduced grass control. So you may be asking yourself, okay, well this is great, but I have a commercial sprayer and this kind of small sprayer wouldn't work on my farm. How else can I make this work effectively? Well, certainly for grass control and Xtendflex soybean, you can also apply them sequentially. So looking at this next slide, here you see the effect of the first 2 bars on the left would be clethodim or Select Max by itself and Roundup Power Max or glyphosate by itself, and obviously good control of the grasses there. And then you see what happened when we tank mixed them, when we applied dicamba first or when we applied dicamba second. And you can see when we apply dicamba first, our control goes down drastically, just like the tank mixture. But when we apply these same 2 herbicides in a different order, apply dicamba after we apply the grass herbicide, we see great control of our grasses comparable to applying the grass herbicide by itself. So herbicide antagonism is certainly an issue with weed control in Xtendflex soybean. And as far as the best types of nozzles to be used in an Xtendflex system with Liberty, if you've got a pulse width modulation sprayer, things like Aim Command, John Deere Exact Apply, Pinpoint and Sharpshooter from Capstan, and Raven Hawkeye, the best types of nozzles would be ones that are non-air inducted. So here I've got some examples. So we've got things like the Soft Drop, which is a new single fan nozzle from Greenleaf. This gave us really good coverage and control, very comparable to one that you may be more familiar with, the Wilger MR. Another new one on the market for this past year, also from Greenleaf, is the BPDF. It's a dual fan nozzle designed for use with pulse width modulation sprayers. And so by having the two different fans at alternating directions on the boom, you basically place one facing this way and then the next nozzle facing like that. Gives you 4 different spray angles of coverage. That one, designed for PWM use, will give you a good amount of coverage and very good control with Liberty or glufosinate. Also, one that's been on the market for a while from T-Jet is the Turbo Twin Fan. So this Turbo Twin Fan can be, multiple different sizes. This is an 02 because that's all I could find at the time. But the twin fan aspect and the fact that it's non-air inducted will make it a very effective nozzle for use with your PWM sprayers. So if you have a conventional sprayer using something like the TADF from Greenleaf, it, again, like the BPDF, has the dual fan and the 2 different angles. So by alternating the nozzles along your sprayer, you can have 4 different spray angles and give you good coverage for control with Liberty. Something like the TT nozzle, one that's been on the market for a long time, is a very, very effective nozzle for use with Liberty. Again, gives you really good coverage, and that's quite important. Something like the AIXR, again, another good nozzle type to be used for glufosinate to give you that good coverage with your sprayer. And then, of course, something like the Guardian Air Twin, again, a twin fan nozzle, but gives you that good coverage that you would expect to need to end up getting good control with Liberty. As you see on this slide, you see the effect of changing droplet size. Here we've got on the far left a 250 micron droplet size spray, and you get in the same area 64 droplets. When you double the droplet size from 250 to 500 microns, you don't get half the number of droplets, you get 8 times fewer droplets. So you go from 64 droplets at 250 microns to 8 droplets at 500 microns. And this is even more extreme when you look at moving to a 1000 micron droplet spray. You go from 8 droplets to 1. Now, of course, for weed science, we always preach the message that you need to spray weeds when they're small. Well, if all you had was 1 droplet in the same area that you have 64, the likelihood of hitting very many small weeds is less. Plus, you have something that's very large and traveling at a high rate of speed. The idea that it's going to deposit on a small weed is not very likely. So it's a huge reason why what we're required to use for dicamba and what works best for glufosinate or Liberty applications are 2 totally separate things. So how do you get the most out of Xtendflex weed control, being able to use Liberty in varieties in 2021? The first thing is that dicamba and Liberty are different herbicides. And as such, because of the restrictions required for use with dicamba, do not apply Liberty with them. You will not get the same, those nozzle types are not going to work well for Liberty. You will not get the same control that you will get out of other nozzle types that are far less restrictive for use with Liberty. So definitely plan to make those applications with different nozzle types. While it would be nice to have one nozzle type to use throughout the season, if you're going to apply Liberty in your crops, that's just not going to work well. Grass control. The same thing that works well for Liberty works well for grass control. Grasses are vertical plants, and so the smaller the droplets that you're able to have, the better the coverage. So again, just like with what works well for Liberty, works well for grass control. For the best success out of Liberty, apply 2 times within 7 to 10 days to ensure you get a really good control. Now, of course, the one thing to point out is make sure you're not exceeding the labeled amount of use of Liberty per season. But you can still do it sequentially, and you may as well, within your first or second shot, throw in a clethodim, a Select Max or a Select 2EC, or something like a Sure 2 or Quizolifop to give you that added grass control. While Liberty itself will give you some grass control, I wouldn't stake my claim on saying it's a great grass control herbicide. I certainly would add something else to the tank. But I think one of the biggest takeaways, and one of the things I have to emphasize more than anything, is make sure before you put an ounce of Liberty on your field that you have Xtendflex soybeans. It's not quite, I think, obvious right now how widely available Xtendflex varieties will be in terms of seed availability, but make sure that if you're going to apply Liberty, that you double check that you've got Xtendflex soybeans and not Roundup Ready to Extend. Those varieties will not withstand Liberty applications, and you'll absolutely fry your soybeans, and that would break my heart to see anything like that come through. So I want to thank Drs. Audrey Gamble and Steve Lee for the opportunity to speak to you. Here's my contact information if you have